Hello and welcome to Connecting Society, a podcast about how everyday data can shape our lives. I'm Shayda Kashef-Tomlins, Senior Public Engagement Manager for Administrative Data Research UK, or ADR UK to me and you.
And I'm Mark Green, Professor of Health Geography. We are your co-hosts and guides around the wonders of administrative data.
In this podcast, we're exploring all the different ways in which the information that's collected about our everyday lives, from our interactions with health services, our voting behaviours, police and crime reporting, educational achievements, and more, is used by researchers and policymakers to make decisions to support society and make the world a better place.
Well, this is very exciting. This is our first ever live episode. Well, not this bit. This is obviously pre-recorded, but we did a live thing in front of an actual audience, which is quite terrifying now I think back to it.
Yeah, we were very brave, weren't we? So why did we do this? This year, ADR UK participated in something called Pint of Science. We did it last year as well, and we thought it was so amazing that this time round we needed to record it. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Pint of Science Festival takes place every year across 3 days in May in England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And the concept is bringing science to the pub. So we did just that. We had two fantastic presenters who discussed their research to ordinary people who chose to spend the evening with us. We've broken up this episode into two parts. In this part, we're going to be listening to Dr. Alice Wickersham deliver her presentation, and we'll hear the audience Q&A that's live. Here we go. Let's take a listen.
Welcome to episode 1. Hello, I'm Alice. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a lecturer at University College London, and I'm a research fellow at King's College London. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the data that shapes our lives. Now, before I get underway, we're going to do a quick exercise. I'm going to go through some questions, and I just want you to think in your head if the answer to any of these questions is yes. So no need to put your hands up, just think about your answer. In the last year, have you done any of the following things? Have you or your child been to school or college? Have you been to see your GP? Or had a hospital appointment? Have you picked up a prescription? Have you gone to work and collected a salary? Or have you collected a pension or a benefit? Okay, if the answer to any of those questions was yes, then congratulations. That means that this year you have generated something called administrative data. Administrative data is information that's routinely collected by public services as part of their day-to-day operations. So it's collected by schools, by hospitals and health services, and also by the workplace. Now, in all likelihood, you're actually well aware that this happens, because how could you possibly miss it? It's been happening for your entire life. Think back to primary school. Every day for 6 years, you sat on one of those horrible, wiry, scratchy carpets, getting pins and needles in your legs, while the teacher read through the register. And when they got to your name, you put your hand up or you said here, and you watched them use a biro to mark your name off in a big book or tick next to your name on a computer. And that was the school collecting administrative data about your attendance. Maybe you just didn't think about it in those specific terms, but that's what it was. Now, the question is, did you ever think about what happened to that information? Well, if you attended a state school in England, what happened was that the school collated that information about your absence every term, and they submitted it to the Department for Education, where it was stored alongside other bits of information about your schooling, like how you did in statutory exams. And the Department for Education then stored this information in a big data set called the National Pupil Database. And for many people in this room, that information is still there in that database to this day. Now that seems mad, right? Because how can anyone possibly care how many times I was absent from school when I was age 7 because I was off sick? I certainly don't remember, but the Department for Education remembers. And they've actually held on to it for some very, very good reasons. And that reason is this. For public services like schools to work well, they need to be able to make policy. Ideally, we want that policy to be evidence-based. How do we get evidence? We conduct research. How do we conduct good research? We need good quality data. So, without keeping that information, everything that makes our public services work well completely crumbles. Now, something that's even more impressive is that under certain circumstances, information collected by one public service can be linked to information collected by another public service in a process that we call data linkage. So, for example, the National Pupil Database has variously been linked to information from health services, from the justice system, and also the workplace. This lets researchers do analyses which could inform policy spanning government departments. So it recognises that none of these aspects of our lives truly operate in isolation. Instead, everything about us is highly interconnected. Now, an obvious question that I'm asked at this point regularly is how can I be sure all of this information out there about me collected by public services is safe? Well, one key thing you need to know is that when a researcher like me gets access to administrative data for research, it's what we call de-identified. This means that personal identifiers like name, date of birth, specific street address, that's stripped out. We don't get access to that. Just to give you an idea of how effective that process is, one of my pieces of research uses a data set of 4.3 million pupils in England born between 1990 and 1997. Now, because of that date range, I know for a fact that I am in my own data set. I'm going to leave my specific birth year up to your imagination. Maybe we can take bets on that in the break. But trust me, I know I'm in there. But I've never attempted to track myself down. And that's for a couple of very good reasons. The first reason is that without information like name and date of birth, it would actually be horrifically difficult to find anyone in this. We like to think we're unique, right? But in the context of 4.3 million people, many of whom have shared characteristics with you, you become a needle in a haystack. The second reason is that when researchers like me apply to access these data, we sign agreements with the data owners saying that we will not attempt to identify anyone in the data set, including ourselves. So if I tried to figure out where I was in this data set, that would constitute a data breach, which would have professional and heavy legal consequences for me as well. And actually, that's just one of many things which safeguard these data. So not only are the data safe because they are often de-identified, but also the projects have to be demonstrated to be in the public interest. The people using them have to be trained. The settings that we access the data in have to be secure. And any outputs we produce based on these data have to be accurate, and they cannot be used to identify any individuals. So, hopefully you're reasonably convinced that your data are safe and secure. Let's now think about a practical example of the sort of research and evidence that we can produce using these data. My research focuses on school performance, and particularly how that performance changes throughout the school career. So, let's recap for anyone whose school feels like quite a long time ago. Typically, we have assessments in England in Year 2, Year 6, and Year 11. So in Year 2 and Year 6, we sit primary school SATs, typically at age 7 and 11 respectively. And then in Year 11, we sit the all-important GCSEs about age 16, which actually many pupils are out there sitting right now at this very moment. I particularly focus on pupils who show declines in their performance over these 3 assessment time points. And what we found is that pupils who show declines in their attainment over their school career are more likely to be diagnosed with mental health disorders like depression, and are also more likely to get involved in criminal offending. Now, I've spoken to young people about these findings, and they've highlighted a couple of things. Firstly, that pupils who are having this experience might be struggling with all sorts of things in their lives. They might be struggling with their home life or their family life. They might be entering the care system or struggling with gang involvement or homelessness, any number of things. So the second thing they highlighted is that potentially declining school performance could be a really powerful signal to notice that pupils are struggling with something and take that as a signal to check in with them and see what they might need support with. So what do we make of that from a policy perspective? Well, potentially we're missing a really important opportunity here to track changing grades more closely, notice early when pupils are struggling, get in there and offer them whatever support it is that they need. That's an example of reasonably current research and how it could inform policy in the future. But what about policy that's happening right now? Well, you only need to look at significant changes in policy and practice to see that many of them are informed by evidence from administrative data. So just as one example, some of you might be aware that recently the government announced plans to reform the special educational needs system. Take a look at the report on the government website and you'll see several graphs which use school data that has been routinely collected by state schools over several decades. Now, obviously that doesn't mean that the policy decision is universally popular, but that's a conversation for another day. The key point is that this sort of policy shift wouldn't be possible if we didn't have evidence underlying it. And so if we didn't have good data informing that evidence and policy, everything that makes public services work well would just crumble. So going back to our exercise at the beginning, we established that probably most, if not everyone in this room, has generated administrative data this year. And if not this year, I can almost guarantee that you have at some point in your lifetime. That means that your data has potentially already been used for research. And it also means that potentially you've already informed policy. And I think that's pretty cool, because it means that you've made a difference to public services and you didn't even have to do anything other than just go about your day-to-day life. That's it. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions. Yeah.
Thank you. So interesting. 5 out of 5 for me in your quiz. My question is more around like international data sharing. So obviously it's about UK policy, but now we live in a globalized society where there's lots of lessons to be learned in other governments all over the world. Do you have any tips or what kind of research are you doing to share data safely with other government bodies around the world, learn best practices and lessons from like other governments around the world too?
Yeah. So sharing data across borders is very challenging. But one thing that's really cool is that now that administrative data is growing in different countries, it enables us more and more to replicate each other's analyses in different countries. So an example of that is some work recently came out of Scandinavia, and Scandinavia historically has kind of led the way in administrative data linkages. So they're really hot on this stuff, and the UK is kind of now really just catching up. And so what I did quite recently is I actually replicated an analysis that had originated from a Scandinavian study, and we found exactly the same patterns as they did. So that's quite a nice way of demonstrating that a lot of countries are grappling with similar issues. And so that's not a direct example of data sharing, but where cross-border data sharing is challenging, at least what we can do is replicate each other's analyses more and more. So that's pretty cool.
Amazing. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, I thought it was really interesting. I was just wondering if you had any opinion on or thoughts on national ID cards and whether they'd make it any easier or less so. I work in the NHS, and in our own systems, we often create multiple IDs for patients because they haven't got a registered NHS number or they've come with a different type of ID that doesn't link. So we have our own linkage problems. I was just wondering what you thought from a research point of view.
Yeah, and I think from a data linkage perspective, that's one of the biggest challenges, that often we are having to infer that people in different services refer to the same individual. So we're having to make almost guesses sometimes about pairs of records belonging together. And that's data linkage is a sort of huge scientific field in itself about how to go about that process. So I think it's probably not a huge surprise from the content and tone of my talk that I would be in favor of anything that makes that easier, because I think then we'll be able to do even more of this sort of cross-domain research where we can support policy that spans these different areas, health, education, crime, rather than acting as though these are all separate things that operate in isolation. But yeah, that's just my personal view.
You're in good company.
Hello, lovely talk, thank you. As someone who works quite closely with GDPR and the Data Protection Act, how does all this fit in? Pre-GDPR, I assume the permissions around right to be forgotten and right to delete data would have been a bit easier. How do you get around those kind of issues now? Is it even covered? Do people even know?
So a lot of this sort of research is done under public task. So that means that it's not consent-based. If you can demonstrate that your research will be of significant public interest, then you can sort of bypass the consent process and access the identified data like this to be done under public task. A lot of the data that I work with also has opt-out mechanisms in place. So I work with some NHS data where that's the case. We publicize the fact that data is going to be used for research in, GP settings and that sort of thing. And if that's an issue for people, then they can contact people and opt out of their data being used in that way. I don't know how smoothly that process operates for different data owners, but certainly that's one of the things that we do in that area. Yeah.
I wonder whether any big areas of data where you feel there's a gap, where you'd love there to be more data around some aspect of our lives that you just can't get at now.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest gap at the moment is that we don't currently have any linkage between health and criminal justice records. And for me, that's a real oversight. We have education linked to justice, we have education linked to health, but there's kind of this missing side of the triangle. And I think that's a real tragedy because I think there are likely to be these very unfortunate pathways that people follow where they become unwell, and that then leads to criminal justice involvement. And, there could be ways of breaking these cycles for people that we might be able to uncover if we were able to do more comprehensive research. But at the moment, we're not just there yet. Hopefully in the next few years, but yeah, not yet.
Thank you. I have a question about sometimes kind of data ownership. So sometimes you hear in the news that maybe the UK has a public contract with, some company that handles, for example, the NHS data. And this always seems concerning because you never know what this company is going to do with, the data they get. But then on the other side, there's researchers that have to go through all of this, permission to get the data. So what's sort of your view on that? It's just like clickbaiting, like pieces of news where it's like there's not really a concern of how these data are going to be used, or there's, should we be concerned?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the first part of the question. So are you thinking just the difference between like commercial uses of data versus this sort of?
Yes.
Yeah. So because I focus on research, I don't have much insight into the commercial uses of these data, to be honest. Shayda, do you know much that you could add to that?
Thank you for your question. I probably should pass on to my co-host actually, because he is a professor who analyzes data as his primary job when he's not co-hosting podcasts. But the work that we do is for research purposes, so it wouldn't really fall under the context that you're asking the question. Right, Mark? Do you want to add anything? But yeah, so you sort of heard the 5 safes that Alice outlined, our safeguards, and there was a conversation there about how the data is being shared, which is through legal gateways. And so that's very different to government departments working alongside private companies for data sharing purposes or anything else. I hope that answers your question.
I had a very short and simple question, actually. I'll go around to my nans and she'll say, I don't want to give my data to these people. They're going to take it and they're going to do whatever they want with it. If I could just say like one thing to her, I guess, from your talk, what would you say I should say to her about that?
I would say, do you want your public services to work well for you? I am aware that people opt out of their data being used for this sort of thing. And I think that's absolutely everyone's prerogative. And I'm not out to change people's minds. But I think it's something to be conscious of, that if you exclude yourself from these kind of data, then you won't be reflected in subsequent research. And you could end up with public services which aren't tailored in such a way that work for you. Great. Yeah.
Sorry if I'm overstepping here, but I'm actually a civil servant, and I spend a fair amount of time in proximity to people who make use of private and public data sets. And I can guarantee you that private data, how can I put this? So what my team does is they use lots of clever technical analytical things to understand global supply chains. Vast majority of the data we use is privately procured, and there's loads of it out there, and it's really easy to get hold of. Trying to get data out of HMRC took us nearly 2 years.
Yeah.
So the point here is there are so many protections around how government uses data, whereas, like, I guarantee you your credit card knows more about you than MI5. There is privately available data. Everything you put into Google is captured by Google and is used to feed you sort of algorithms, and we know all that. But the limitations on what we can do with public data are incredibly restrictive. So if that's reassuring or not, or makes a lot of people's life difficult, I don't know, but I'll stop now.
Yeah, no, I have no qualms with that observation. Like, as you say, getting access to these public data is very challenging, and it takes a really long time. There's one particular data set I've been waiting on for over a year now, and there's no signs of getting it yet. But I kind of don't really take issue with that, because I know that it's surrounded by so many safeguards, which I personally think is really important. So I guess from my perspective, I would rather have to navigate those safeguards as long as they take to end up with data that I have kind of confidence in, as it were, than get these kind of speedier private data. But there is a place as well for that private data, and I know that people make use of both. Was there a question attached to it? Because I don't know if I've answered it. It's just an observation. Yeah.
Has anyone ever tried to hack into the administrative data sets?
Has anyone ever tried? I mean, I don't know, but seems
that's
likely,
even worse, isn't it? Because we don't even know if they've worked. Yeah.
Shayda, do you know?
Trusted research environments. I don't know about hacking, but I do know that a lot of applications to access data are denied. So it's really rigorous what they check for.
With the limited data sets you have then, given you can't know everything about everybody, how do you try and extract causal versus casual relationships on what you're looking at?
It's very challenging, and there are growing techniques to try and do that. So there's a growing analytical style called quasi-experimental trials, which is where you use observed data and you essentially adjust for as many confounds as you possibly can to the point where you can infer that one thing causes the other. I think that style of analysis is somewhat in its infancy. Like, it's been around for a good few years, but in relative terms, I think it's something that's growing and that we're gradually getting better at. But there are ways that we try and approach that kind of causal inference. Yeah.
Thanks.
Fascinating point. Any evidence of doing randomized control trials in public sector? Because I think that's a really challenging thing to do, but it's directly to your point, it creates amazing data for research.
Well, we do randomized control trials, and for a lot of them you have to gather primary data, right? So you're recruiting people and getting data. But what can happen is that you can do a randomized control trial and then apply to get it linked to this sort of administrative data. So you can enrich these primary studies where you've had to collect stuff from scratch, and by bringing in more data from the outside. Shayda, were you going to elaborate on that?
No, I was just going to add, and thank you, because I wasn't aware of that. I was just going to add that sometimes there are natural experiments which almost allow that to happen. So the passing of a law gives you a cut between what happened before and then what happened after. Thank you. You're going to have to save that. Sorry, guys. But actually, on that, well, let's thank Alice.
Wow, that was really good. What a great evening. And what's really sad is we haven't thought about a twist for the end of part 1 to keep you gripped.
No, we don't have a twist, but you're not going to want to miss out on part 2, where we're going to hear from Professor Ian Brennan talking about knife crime and data reporting.
Until next time, stay curious about how your everyday data shapes society.